I ended my last politics video by saying I don't think I'm going to be making another politics video until the gun bans come in February. Well, it's not February, and here I am making another politics video. I have to say, I did not see the absolute chaos that went on Monday happening. Like, I had no clue that we were this close to chaos, and it seemed to have caught everyone by surprise. And now we're in an almost new political reality. So, let me run you through what has happened and how this specifically will affect the firearm bans and Trudeau's gun ban stuff that was supposed to come in February and March. And I'll run you through a few scenarios. It all seemingly began Friday behind closed doors when Trudeau gave Freeland a Zoom call telling her she would no longer be the finance minister. Now, on that same Zoom call, Freeland was reportedly told that Mark Carney would be taking her job. Then moved to Saturday. Housing Minister Sean Fraser reportedly was exiting the government, and he would announce it in the coming days. Then we had a lull on Sunday. There were some reports that a cabinet shuffle would take place on Wednesday due to Sean Fraser leaving and some other readjustments, and Chrystia Freeland being told that she was no longer going to be there, and Mark Carney coming in. But then things took a dramatic turn. In the morning, on Monday, in which Freeland was supposed to deliver the document that would announce that we had blown past the fiscal anchor set by her, she resigned. And this is quite a scathing letter to Trudeau. And there's a lot of things to read into it. Really, there's only one paragraph that I think sums up everything totally. She says, "We need to take that threat extremely seriously," speaking of the U.S. tariffs. "That means keeping our fiscal powder dry so we have the reserves we need for a coming tariff war. That means eschewing costly political gimmicks which we can ill afford and make Canadians doubt that we recognize the gravity of the moment." Now, those costly political gimmicks are almost certainly in reference to the GST holiday and the $250 checks, which now no longer seem to be happening. But to be honest, it encompasses a lot of Trudeau's everything, right? The gun ban, the confiscation, the expanding of it is absolutely a political gimmick. It's not going to happen. He's going to lose the next election, and there's no way it could even logistically go forward just because of how insanely costly it is, right? The estimated cost of the GST holiday and the $250 checks is somewhere around $6 billion. The cost of doing the confiscation program the way they want is likely going to cost at least $6 billion, possibly even $10 billion if they were to actually go through with it. But that's not actually what's going to happen for a number of reasons, and we'll get into that. So, there was chaos throughout the day that spawned from this. No one knew who was going to present the fall economic statement. No one knew who the hell was going to be finance minister. Everything was in chaos. It was maybe the most chaotic day of Canadian politics that I've ever seen. It almost certainly was. And then we got to later in the day when it was told that Dominic LeBlanc would become the new finance minister. Now, if that name sounds familiar to you, well, it's because one, he was Trudeau's babysitter, so of course he would get the job, and two, he was a public safety minister. Now, there was a lot of confusion about whether or not he would stay on as public safety minister. He didn't really confirm it in his words to the press after his appointment, but the Gun Blog published yesterday, as I'm recording this on December 17th, that he will be leaving the Department of Public Safety. So that leaves it in limbo. And we are really, truly in limbo right now. So, with this limbo, we have three distinct possibilities of what could happen. I'm going to run through those three possibilities, and then I'll circle back and talk about how this could potentially affect the planned gun and magazine changes that were supposed to come in February and March, and then we'll talk about how this affects things long term after that. Number one, what will the NDP do? Now, on CBC, on the day of this chaos going on, Peter Julian, the NDP House leader, gave an interview to David Cochrane in which he said this.
And you say that voting no is one of the tools you have available to them. But am I understanding you correctly that if Justin Trudeau is Prime Minister in February or March, 100% the NDP votes non-confidence in the government when it comes to the floor of the House of Commons?
When it's a straight up confidence motion, if at the end of February, early March, if we have the continued debacle that we're seeing here and the Prime Minister has not stepped down, though I doubt that. I mean, I think the odds are that he will heed the message tonight from his own caucus and his own cabinet. We simply cannot continue like this. So yes, the NDP, as the adults in the room, would step up on that.
Now, as you just heard, Peter Julian confirmed what a lot of pundits and individuals and MPs and everyone else was thinking, in that the only reason the NDP has not, well, not the only reason, but the main reason the NDP has not voted down the government is because of Jagmeet Singh's pension. Now, what do I mean by that? Jagmeet Singh's pension comes into effect on, I believe, February 25th. And if we're looking at the parliamentary sitting calendar for 2025, which is what this is on your screen, you will see that there's essentially 2 weeks in which the NDP could vote non-confidence. If Trudeau stays on as leader, and therefore the NDP follows through with what they say, and that they will vote down the government, if he should choose to do that, and Jagmeet Singh's pension is on February 25th, the vote of no confidence would have to come on February 26th through 28th, or between March 17th through 21, because the Parliament is not sitting on the first 2 weeks of March. So there's your scenario number one. An election is called between February 26th and 28th, or between March 17th and 21st. Scenario number two, Trudeau steps down. Now, if we take a look at the calendar for 2024, we can see that Parliament is no longer sitting. I'm recording this on December 18th, and the Parliament rose and will not return until January 27th. And so you have 6 weeks in which Trudeau could resign while Parliament is not sitting. Now, let's go into the hypothetical of what would happen if he did resign. If Trudeau did resign, the standard thing in Canadian politics is for the leader to not only resign their leadership of the party, but also relinquish their leadership of the country. So he would no longer be Prime Minister, and there would be an interim Prime Minister while the Liberal Party figures out who their next leader is. And that leadership contest would occur either while Parliament is sitting or while Parliament is prorogued. Second scenario kind of has two subdividing scenarios. If it occurs while Parliament is actively sitting and they're having parliamentary meetings, then the NDP, according to what they say, would prop up the government and keep them going until a leader is chosen. And how long would that take? Well, no one really knows. It theoretically could take as much as a few days, or it could take as much as a few months. So we could get a new prime minister anywhere between sometime in January and sometime in June. We have no idea. Absolutely no idea. And we won't know until it actually happens. My guess is it's somewhere in the middle. If Trudeau were to resign in January, I think we would have a new Liberal leader and therefore a new prime minister sometime in April. Again, complete speculation. The other option in this scenario is that Trudeau prorogues. Now, what that means is that Parliament sitting days stop. There's no more sitting days while Parliament is prorogued, and we're just waiting for the Liberals to elect a leader. So that means all of these green days you see would go away until a Liberal leader is chosen, in which Parliament would then resume with the new Prime Minister. Now, scenario number 3 is slightly different in that Trudeau would stay on as Prime Minister throughout the 6 weeks that he has off in January, and he would let Parliament sit, because this is the other thing to keep in mind. Trump's inauguration is on January 20th, and his tariffs are supposed to go into effect day 1. So what's likely to happen under this third scenario is that Trudeau would let Parliament resume. We would have essentially 3 straight weeks of dealing with the Trump tariffs in Parliament. And then he would prorogue Parliament in this off week. Very likely he would do that, because that is the week right before Singh's pension kicks in. Now, this scenario, in my opinion, is the most unlikely because this would be the most chaotic country, or at least first world country in the world, if this were to happen. For a lot of reasons, not just the gun ban reasons. But if Trudeau were to prorogue Parliament right here, Parliament would then not be sitting until really the next election. There would be no more sitting. Remember, the NDP would vote to bring down the government if Trudeau was still leader. And the reason he would prorogue is to avoid that vote. And if you're thinking to yourself, this is absolutely insane, I can't believe he would do this, there's precedent for this. Prime Minister Stephen Harper did exactly this in 2008. The Liberals, the NDP, and the Bloc were to form a coalition government and vote down the government, and instead, Harper prorogued, the Liberals went into chaos, and then that vote disappeared because the coalition no longer existed. So there is precedent for this happening. What there's not precedent for is all of the external factors making this happen. So if we look at the sitting calendar for 2025, again, if Trudeau were to prorogue with the goal of avoiding a Parliament non-confidence vote, he would have to prorogue this week, and he would have to avoid the sitting at the end of February, all of March, all of April, all of May, and almost all of June. July and August have no parliamentary sitting dates because that's the summer break. It's the case every single year. And you would think, okay, well then they'll resume in September. But there's a catch. And the catch is the legal minimum and legal limit of an election period. Now, by law, the next Canadian election must take place on or before October 20th. But that's not it. Election laws in Canada state that an election must be at minimum 36 days in length and at maximum 50 days in length. And if we go back 30 days, or 36 days in length, well, guess what? We're right here. For Trudeau to prorogue Parliament, such that he would avoid a no-confidence vote, he would only need to do it for 4 months instead of potentially 5 or 6 months, because the election would have to take place or start in September. It couldn't start any later. So, those are the three scenarios, two of which result in an election starting in September and ending with the election date being October 20th, and one of them starts with an election starting in February, likely ending sometime in the end of March, beginning of April. Well, the first thing to mention is the things that were mentioned in the Fall Economic Statement. Now, the Fall Economic Statement says that they are providing $600 million starting in 24-25 for the confiscation program. But it is very important to note, that the spending is planned over 3 years. So $200 million roughly over the next 3 years. And so this is what's been happening with the Canadian gun ban since 2020. They keep announcing funding, but then splitting that funding up over multiple years, eventually reaching the end date of the amnesty, extending the amnesty, and repeat. So they're doing this again, in which there's no chance that $600 million over 3 years, let alone over a single year, would cover the cost of the confiscation program. Like I said, minimum $6 billion, maximum around 10-ish billion. It's not going to cover any of that, so this means that it's going to be abandoned and extended the confiscation program date again, if the Liberals were to win the next election, which they're not, and we'll go into at the end. What it does mean with $600 million, so essentially $200 million for the next year, is that the programs that were announced in the last few weeks could go ahead, and I mean specifically for businesses. So if you don't know how Canadian politics works, even if there is no minister that is currently leading a ministry, the ministry still operates. However, it operates without any aim, and it essentially just uses the guidelines that were set before it. And the guidelines that were set before it were the confiscation program, specifically the business confiscation program. We have gone, in the days after that I made those videos, we got a list of a bunch of compensation money for all the parts and guns that were being confiscated from businesses specifically, not from individuals, from businesses. And it would only encompass the 2020 ban stuff. None of the stuff since. Which is, again, another reason why it's likely not to happen. But because all of that work has already been done, and they have $200 million to work with for this upcoming year, it's entirely possible that businesses will be offered their compensation for their confiscated parts and weapons, but that's all that would happen, right? There's no money to actually set up a mass public confiscation. There's no money to set up anything like it. And importantly, there's no money to even set up any of the compensation for the guns that were banned and the parts that were banned just a couple weeks ago. It only applies to the stuff that was banned in 2020 because that list hasn't been drafted yet. So unless they are actively drafting the list now, which is way bigger than the 2020 ban, there's just no shot, right? It's not going to happen. And so with that out of the way, now we can talk about how this affects the sitting calendar. Now, remember, LeBlanc said at the press conference when he announced the gun bans that there would be new gun regulations and law changes coming at the end of February, beginning of March. Now, again, look at the sitting calendar. According to that timeline, it would have to come in this week or in this week. There's no other timeline where it could happen. The regulations could be in the in-between if they were to do it, but any legislative changes wouldn't be able to be done until mid-March or the very end of February. And when we combine that with the scenarios that I presented beforehand, there's really only one scenario where this can go through, and that is the scenario where Trudeau prorogues Parliament because he wants to stay on as leader. If that were to happen, then while Parliament is prorogued, he could do more Order in Council bans, and that would come in very likely the beginning of March, because he doesn't need Parliament to sit to do executive orders like that. Any of the Order in Council powers are done without Parliament, so it doesn't matter if they're sitting or not, he can do them. The other thing to keep in mind is that public safety currently has a vacancy. With public safety's vacancy going on, until that position is filled, like I said earlier, they're kind of on autopilot. Once that position gets filled, it's going to be by a yes man to Trudeau, right? Like every cabinet position is. Which means if Trudeau were to go with the scenario of proroguing to keep his job, it's very likely that the gun ban would go through. Because like I've said before, it's what the Liberals use to change the channel for like 24 hours, right? Distract people from all the chaos going on. Hey, let's talk about this gun ban, and then everything inevitably goes back to the chaos because it's so chaotic. But if the NDP were to vote down the government on the timeline that I said, so this week or this week, well then the regulations might happen, but any of the legislative changes would not happen. And if it happens in the week that Singh gets his pension, then the regulations probably aren't happening either. So under that scenario, nothing's happening. Now, under the scenario of Trudeau resigning, and whether he prorogues Parliament or not, and has a leadership race, the gun bans are also very unlikely to happen, simply because any policy proposals that were done by Trudeau are unlikely to continue beyond what has already started. Because it's entirely possible that the new leader that comes in to lead the party, well, it's guaranteed that they're going to be anti-gun, of course, but it's likely that they might change their tune economically. Because the gun ban and the confiscation is so unbelievably expensive, and most of the friction in the Liberal Party is about Trudeau himself and the monetary policy itself, there's a good chance that they decide, you know what, we're canceling the confiscation and it's just going to be grandfathered like the machine guns were grandfathered back in the, 70s or 80s. And even if that is the case, because the Liberal leadership race would be going on for so long, again, at least a few weeks, very likely a couple of months, the leader wouldn't be able to come in until maybe the end of March at the earliest. And then would they really, as their first order of business, do more gun ban stuff when they very likely would have been elected on economic issues? I doubt it. Of course, it's possible. Nothing's impossible, but I just highly doubt that that would be the case. And again, regardless of any of that, of whatever they believe or want to implement, they don't have time, right? Let's say they get in April. They only have like 2 months, and then the election is they don't get to sit again. Parliament doesn't sit again. They have to call the election. And very likely, under the scenario where there is a new Liberal leader, they probably call an election themselves anyway, simply because there's no sitting dates, so they may as well call it, because they can't get anything passed that they want to. In which case, we might have a summer election. So under all of these scenarios, new legislation is now very unlikely. Regulations are still absolutely possible. So with how the gun ban plays into all of those scenarios, ultimately gun owners are left with two situations. Either we get our guns back in the summer, or we get our guns back in the fall. And that leads into the final part of this video again, where I talk about public polling. Look at this graph! Thank you, Chad. Now, as you can see from what Chad showed you, public polling is very bad for the Liberals, like catastrophically bad. The last chance the Trudeau Liberals had for any kind of political comeback was the Trump presidency and trying to leverage that to their advantage, but that has failed miserably, as we can see from the results over the last few weeks. But more specifically, I want to take a look at Abacus's latest poll. Now, I'm going to have this link. I'm going to have almost all of this stuff linked in the description. But this poll right here is astounding. All of the results of this poll were done at 5 p.m. on Monday through the morning of Tuesday. So all of this, everything here is post the chaos that was seen on Monday. To really drive home the point that all of this is after the chaos, 81% of people in this poll had at least heard about Freeland's resignation, and at least 42% were following it fairly closely. Those are astounding numbers, like genuinely crazy numbers. If you were following the politics in Canada from all of Trudeau's other affairs, SNC, WeChat, whatever, or WeCharity, you'll know that the amount of people that were following it or that had heard about it was much, much lower, and this was after months. This is within hours of this happening. Literally half a day, and 81% of the country heard about it. That is unbelievable. And it shows. Should Trudeau stay or resign? 67% of people think he should resign. And 58% of people want an election right now. Including 35% of Liberals and 47% of NDP. And if we take a look at the vote intention from this poll, there wasn't much change, but it held steady. 25-point lead for the Conservatives. And if we look at the absolutely certain to vote, it's almost 30. And the reason this certain to vote is so important is because of the by-election that took place on Monday night. That's right, there was even more chaos. As you can see, the by-election on Monday night in Vancouver was a shit-kicking of the Liberals. 66.3% of people voted for the Conservatives. This is a riding that the Liberals won with 39% of the vote in the 2021 election. They lost it in the 2019 election, but they won it in the 2015 election. So 2 of the last 3 elections the Liberals held this by very close margins. But the Conservatives won here by 50%. An entire majority difference between the Conservatives and the Liberals. However, what a lot of Liberals will say is that only 16.2% of people came out to vote, which is an incredibly small number of people. But the people that came out to vote were very motivated, obviously, by the margin of victory here. And what that also tells us is that the people that didn't come out to vote were very unmotivated and were very likely Liberal and NDP supporters. So when we look at the certain to vote tab, what it's saying is that more conservatives are certain to come out and vote, that no matter what, they are going out to vote, and NDP and Liberals are more unlikely to actually go out and vote, which means the vote share for the Conservatives genuinely could actually reach as much as 50% come the election whenever it happens, if these trends hold, which they've been holding for over a year, almost 2 years at this point. So with all that said, yeah, it's the end of the Trudeau Liberals. They're done, they're gone, they have no chance of staying in power. The only question is when the election will be held. Is it going to be held in March or the end of April, or is it going to be held in October during the fall? There's no other possibilities. It all comes down to Jagmeet Singh's pension, which is a fucking clown show. It is farcical that that's happening in a modern Canadian society, but it is what it is. And with our guns, they're locked up in their safes. Further gun bans are at the very least unlikely, and even if they were to happen, legislation is basically impossible, and by the end of the year, we're going to end up with our guns back anyway. And if for whatever reason you still don't believe the Conservatives are going to undo all the bullshit, there's no helping you. If you don't believe the Conservatives are going to help you, then there's no one to help you, so either go live out in the woods away from everyone, or give up your shit, because there's no other option. And with that, that is the end of the video. I'm not going to commit to whether or not I'm going to make a video before the next gun bans, just because things are so crazy politically. So for now, that is it for this video. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good day.